The Great Lakes are a beautiful and mysterious part of the United States, and they're very near and dear to me personally, as I have a lot of fond memories of the family there. I still love the gorgeous scenery and never-ending sky to this day. However, I see the state a little bit differently now than I did when I was a kid. A few years back, my other grandfather told me a story about how back in the day they would tie up their boats to an obelisk-like stone that would peek out of the water when the water elevation was low enough. This got me thinking that maybe there's something more going on under there than I originally assumed. We're told that about 20,000 years ago, the climate warmed and the ice sheets retreated. Water melted and filled basins forming the Great Lakes. But of course, this is mainstream history. In the last video on Chicago, many people were asking us, well, what about the lakes? The lakes aren't there, so this can't be true. Well, let's keep in mind what the entire purpose of cartography is, and that's accuracy. These were used for navigation, so it was crucial to have accurate maps. So what we have here is that before the 1600s, we clearly have maps that show the Great Lakes not there, including Mercator's map from 1569. Also, again, notice how California is not depicted as an island just yet.
Now, as we get into the 1600s, we have some big changes. First off, there were many earthquakes during this time. One of the biggest that we know of was called the 1663 Charlevoix earthquake, which had the perceived intensity of X or extreme on the Mercalli intensity scale. They even tell us that this event was very similar to the New Madrid earthquake, but this 1663 earthquake happened right in the Great Lakes area. Also, weirdly enough, that during the 1600s is when they switched off the Julian calendar. So, then we look at the maps around 1680s, we start to see more lakes. There are still some things missing and it still looks different, as now California is an island, but we can start to see that there are some changes in the landscape. Look at the details and all the cities around the island of California. You really think this is just a mistake? And why is Lake Michigan called Lake Illinois? So we begin to move forward into the 18th century, and here, in 1750, they still have California as an island on these maps. But they tell us that they were too stupid to realize that this wasn't the case, I guess. Now if we look at Bellin's map of the Great Lakes in 1775, we can see that there are some islands that are depicted that are no longer there. The story goes that Bellin was a highly regarded mapmaker. He was crucial in the people's perception of that region. He had a reputation on the line, so why would he just make up all these islands for no reason? It wasn't until 1832 that these were removed. Now, this might have to be its own video, but there's something called the Lake Michigan's Bermuda Triangle, where many people seem to go missing, and this has been happening for the past 100 years or so. In 1891, a schooner called Thomas Hume set off across the lake to pick up lumber, and overnight, it disappeared along with its crew of 7 sailors. It all has to do with the strange weather phenomena in this area that seems to have a consciousness of its own. I found it interesting that mainstream science is saying that there was a comet that hit North America right in this area around 12,000 years ago, which is the typical answer for anything they can't or won't explain. There's also a Stonehenge under Lake Michigan, and a depiction of a mastodon that seems to get a lot of media attention and further supports the idea that the last time there was life around here was the ever so distant caveman times. Actually, there are multiple towns that are underwater all over the US, and there's this theme of purposely flooding towns. There's also the Mill Roaches powerhouse, and I don't know if this is old world or not, but I do find it interesting and I thought I should bring it up, so please share your thoughts in the comments if you know more. The building looks to be a plantation type home, and they say it was built in the 1900s. Could be, but I was looking at the old drawings and I saw that common arch that you see in star forts, and it just made me curious as to if there's something else going on with the story. Michigan also has an underwater ghost town that was flooded, the Rawsonville Ghost Town, that was flooded in 1920. It is said to have many mills, factories, a general store, a wagon maker, and 3 saloons. They say that in the 1880s the city started to fail and people left, so in 1920 they needed to erect the Huron River Dam, which, when erected, submerged the structures in the newly formed Belleville Lake.
When it comes to the mainstream narrative, there's usually at least a vein of truth in the stories they set up. I remember a while ago there was this video on the Conspiracy Arts channel, which I'm not sure why it's not there anymore, but there was this really good video on the Carolina Bays. Basically, he was going over how in the 1930s they started taking aerial photographs, and they noticed these elliptical depressions that were all over the place, and the highest concentration of them was in the Carolinas and Georgia. Interestingly, each one of these bays has a specific orientation. Now, in Nebraska, they have these similar formations, but they don't call them bays, they call them rainwater basins. So if we look at the correlation between the Nebraska bays, the Carolina bays, and the Saginaw impact, we can see that all of these orientations are pointed in a specific direction, and they all connect to one area, the Great Lakes. This is when we get into the glacier ice impact hypothesis, or the mainstream explanation of the Younger Dryas period. There are even some more popular scientific studies that speculate that a meteor did hit this area. So we're really just questioning the dating of this impact. Some of you might ask, how could they get that wrong? Or why would they even want to push the dating back to cover this up? Well, in 1852, compulsory schooling became mainstream for Americans, and around that same time, Native children were ripped from their families and put into boarding schools all over the country. All of this in order to re-educate children. This is around the same time that the orphan trains were happening, so it's not crazy to consider the idea that maybe a large catastrophe created a surplus of displaced children, and maybe even children brought in from other countries. This would mean that the people who found them would be in charge of their education. Some children were surely taken in by religious organizations to build a bigger community for the church, so it seems like the only options for these orphans was either church or these boarding schools. And these churches or boarding schools probably either resembled or were exactly the same as any other asylum. So this would basically mean that all these children knew was what they were programmed to know. Unless maybe there were some children who maybe kept memories of their families and cultures. But I think that the intentions of these asylum authorities, bankers, philanthropists, and the like, was to remove an entire generation from their families and histories and displace them in an unfamiliar land so that they would require help from these generous philanthropists. I'm sure we've all seen that pattern of behavior before. It isn't so hard to believe that these children were given reading material designed to mold their perception of reality in the world we live in, making them malleable, mindless workers for a callous upper class to openly exploit. These historical figures could be real, and I'm sure some of them were, but it's just as likely that some of them were just talking heads put in place to propagate specific ideas and beliefs. Doesn't that seem to be the case in modern times? Celebrities nowadays are not so different.
Through the 16th and 17th centuries, there were several observations of sky phenomena that don't fit our modern mainstream narrative at all. But many of these observations included comets, as shown in many old manuscripts and engravings. Specifically, this event called the Late Comet or Blazing Star, as it appeared in New England in December of 1664. There seems to be nothing on the subject on Wikipedia or any historical websites. We have to look at old books on comets if we want to know about some of these observations. One book by Samuel Danforth gives the details of the event involving the blazing star of 1664. His book was one of the first works on astronomy in America. According to him, this is literally the first thing he says in the book, quote, "This comet is no sublunary meteor or sulfurous exhalation, but a celestial luminary moving in the starry heavens." End quote. He talks about this sulfurous vapor that has been seen in other events, or what he calls fiery meteors. So what is this guy even talking about? I wouldn't be surprised if this is the real reason they don't want to talk about this. And actually, if you search for Blazing Star New England, a species of flower is the only thing that comes up. There's so much to cover, but he says that this is no fiery comet, that this was something different. this blazing star event of 1664 was not a normal comet, but some type of celestial luminary that came and just floated for 3 months, and it was visible to all countries and nations. He says, quote, "It was seen from Virginia, Jamaica, St. Martha, Cartagena, and Barbados, and no doubt it was visible to the whole world." End quote. So this gets kind of crazier because whoever wrote this book was obviously looking at this from a heliocentric globe perspective, and so he makes a note where he says, quote, "The highest region of the air is accounted not much above 50 English miles from the Earth, and had this comet been no higher, it had been impossible that other countries and nations so far distant should have been held it." End quote. What an interesting observation. You're right, that would be impossible on a globe. Yet, some type of luminary event occurred over America in the 1600s, and it was witnessed by the entire world. He says, quote, "Whether or not this comet was created in the beginning of the world, together with the rest of the stars, and hath been hidden in the height and profundity of the heavens, and at a certain time descending toward the earth, becoming visible and signal to the world." End quote. I mean, that's a pretty crazy thought, and what does that even imply? He clearly says that this body was not opaque but transparent as the sun shined through it. Then, he begins to lay out the dates and constellations that were visible during these events. This is no imaginary fiction he's writing. It seems more so that the people had different ideas of what was really going on at this time, and this was due to them actually experiencing events similar to this one that has now been suppressed from mainstream history. The reason why is because it doesn't fit their narrative. This book clearly goes over what's called erratic bodies, where these comets do strange movements and dances in the sky. That shouldn't be possible if we're orbiting the sun at 67,000 miles per hour, and you shouldn't be able to see the same event from all around the globe. This comet was also called a wandering star. Quote, "The true color and splendor of the comet was always one and the same, but its apparent color was various and diverse. At first appearance, its color was pale and obscure, afterward bright and radiant. At length it grew very obscure and faint like a cloudy star. In the West Indies, it appeared fiery red and dreadful." He goes on to say, quote, "The Holy Scriptures, which are the authentic and unerring canon of truth, teach us to look at comets as portentous and signal of great and notable changes." End quote. So yeah, this guy was religious, but I mean, he's not wrong. Throughout history, comets have been associated with legends of myths of some type of change or even reset, you could say. There's also another book by Thomas Jones that goes over this exact same thing, connecting comets and the supernatural once again. There are actually many books on this subject of supernatural comets from the 17th to 18th centuries. I noticed that many of the libraries containing these old books contain emblems with Freemasonic symbols as well. Also, during the New Madrid earthquakes, this was interestingly preceded by the arrival of a comet called Tecumseh's Comet, also known as the Great Comet of 1811. It lasted for 261 days from the years 1811 to 1812. The Europeans called it Napoleon's Comet. According to the tale, Tecumseh was a Shawnee mystic and military leader who's remembered as a great hero. It's said that his name meant shooting star or he who walks across the sky. It's also noted that his brother was a religious leader known as the Prophet, who predicted a major solar eclipse in 1806 and was challenged by William Henry Harrison to produce another miracle. The solar eclipse of September 17, 1811 occurred not long after. And this is super weird, but there are many references to the event in pop culture. I even found a musical play on Broadway called Natasha, Pierre, and the Great Comet of 1812. And this is actually based on Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace, where Pierre actually gives a description of the event. Now look at the cover for this play. Do you think they know something? Why would they choose the double phoenix symbol representing the Phoenician royalty? Here's a paragraph from the original book. Quote, "It was clear and frosty. Above the dirty, ill-lit streets, above the black roofs, stretched the dark, starry sky. Only looking up at the sky did Pierre cease to feel how sordid and humiliating were all mundane things compared with the heights to which his soul had just been raised. At the entrance to the Arbat Square, an immense expanse of dark starry sky presented itself to his eyes. Almost in the center of it, above the Prichistinka Boulevard, surrounded and sprinkled on all sides by stars, but distinguished from them all by its nearness to the Earth. Its white light and its long uplifted tail shone the enormous and brilliant comet of 1812. The comet, which was said to portend all kinds of woes and the end of the world. In Pierre, however, that comet with its long luminous tail aroused no feeling of fear. On the contrary, he gazed joyfully, his eyes moist with tears, at this bright comet which, having traveled in its orbit with inconceivable velocity through immeasurable space, seemed suddenly like an arrow piercing the earth, to remain fixed in a chosen spot, vigorously holding its tail erect, shining and displaying its white light amid countless other scintillating stars. It seemed to Pierre that this comet fully responded to what was passing in his own softened and uplifted soul, now blossoming into a new life. The book continues to describe the vast changes in the world that happened after the appearance of this magnificent comet. Seems to be some type of post-reset propaganda if you ask me, since Tolstoy is one of the most famous writers of all time. Was there some type of event that happened through the 1600s to 1812 period that drastically shaped and transformed the landscape of North America? Was this systematically suppressed or forgotten after the reset?
So let's try to imagine that this really did happen. What if we questioned some of the rock formations in Michigan, like Castle Rock or Turnip Rock, or these arches? It makes you wonder if they're truly natural. These could have been old world structures that were petrified after this event. These formations remind me of some of the stuff you might see in Ireland. Anyway, what do you think of all this? How do you think these lakes came about? There's definitely a lot more to cover in Michigan alone. The world really is a mysterious place. If you want to get in contact with us, you can go to our Discord, Instagram, or shoot us an email at the link in the description. Have an awesome weekend, and all we can hope is that our minds will be unveiled.
Let go of everything you think to be true. Relax the mind and ask the question, do I truly understand what this reality is?